You settle into your chair as the desert wind howls outside your newspaper office in Tombstone, Arizona Territory, 1885. The American frontier is a place where civilization meets chaos, where fortunes are made and lost on the turn of a card, and where a man's reputation can be his most valuable or most dangerous possession. The era you're documenting spans roughly from 1865 to 1890, the golden age of the American cowboy. This is post-Civil War America, where displaced soldiers, freed slaves, Mexican vaqueros, and fortune seekers from around the world converge in cattle towns, mining camps, and railroad boomtowns across Texas, Kansas, Colorado, and the territories beyond. It's a time when law enforcement is sparse, justice is often personal, and disputes are settled with lead and steel. The cowboy culture you're witnessing isn't just about cattle drives and rodeos. It's about a complex code of honor inherited from Southern gentleman traditions, Mexican vaquero customs, and frontier necessity. A man's word is his bond. An insult demands satisfaction, and backing down from a fight can mean social death in a community where reputation determines whether you live or die. In this world, the one-on-one gunfight becomes the ultimate test of character. These aren't random acts of violence, but ritualized confrontations where two men face death to settle matters of honor, love, money, or pride. The stories you're about to uncover represent the most legendary of these encounters. Some famous, others lost to history until now. So dim the lights, settle back, and let me take you through the dusty streets and smoky saloons where legends were born and men became myths with nothing more than iron on their hips and steel in their spines. Let's start today's first story. Lie down and listen. You're standing in Springfield, Missouri on the 21st of July, 1865. The Civil War has ended just 3 months ago, and the country is still bleeding from 4 years of brothers killing brothers. In this border state town, former Union and Confederate soldiers eye each other warily across saloon floors still sticky with tobacco juice and suspicion. James Butler Hickok Wild Bill, to everyone who values their health sits at a corner table in Lion House, his back to the wall as always. At 28, he's already legendary as a Union scout, spy, and the man who killed the McCannell's gang in a gunfight that left 3 men dead and Bill without a scratch. His blonde hair falls to his shoulders, his mustache is perfectly waxed, and his twin navy colts rest in a red sash around his waist, butts forward in the cavalry style. Across the smoky room, Davis Tutt leans against the bar, his dark eyes fixed on Hickok's table. Tutt fought for the Confederacy, and though the war is over, some wounds run deeper than politics. The two men had been friends once, back when friendship seemed possible between a Kansas abolitionist and an Arkansas rebel. They'd hunted together, shared bottles, even courted the same women. But friendship, you've learnt in this business, is a luxury the frontier rarely affords. The trouble started over a poker game 3 nights ago. Hickok had been on a winning streak that defied mathematics, his pile of gold coins and greenbacks growing, while other players' fortunes dwindled. Tutt, never one to fold when pride was involved, kept raising the stakes until he'd lost nearly everything, including his prized Waltham gold pocket watch, a family heirloom from his grandfather. "I'll be wanting that watch back, Bill," Tutt had said, his southern drawl thick with whiskey and wounded pride. Hickok had examined the timepiece, its gold case catching the lamplight. "Well now, Davis, you lost this fair and square. Cost you $85 if you want it back." But $85 might as well have been $800 to a Confederate veteran in 1865. The South's currency was worthless, jobs were scarce, and a man's pride was often all he had left. So Tut did the only thing a proud southern gentleman could do. He took the watch anyway. Now, 3 days later, you watch Tut pull that gold watch from his vest pocket with deliberate slowness, making sure Hickok sees the chain glinting in the afternoon light, streaming through the saloon's dirty windows. The entire room goes quiet. Conversations die mid-sentence. Cards remain unplayed in trembling hands. Even the piano player's fingers freeze over the keys. Hickok rises slowly from his chair, his spurs chiming softly against the wooden floor. He's dressed in his finest, a dark frock coat, checkered trousers, and a silk vest that costs more than most men make in a month. But it's his eyes that hold your attention, pale blue and cold as a Kansas winter, devoid of any human warmth. Davis, Hickok's voice carries clearly through the silence, each word measured and careful. I reckon you'd best not wear that watch in public. Tut straightens, his hand moving instinctively toward the Colt at his hip. It's my watch now, Bill, and I'll wear it when and where I please. The two men stare at each other across the room, 20 feet of sawdust and tobacco-stained floorboards between them and eternity. You can hear the grandfather clock in the corner ticking, marking seconds that stretch like hours. Someone coughs nervously. A glass clinks against the bar. Then we have ourselves a difficulty, Hickok says finally. What happens next unfolds with the terrible inevitability of a Greek tragedy. The two men agree to meet in the town square at 6 o'clock, when the evening shadows are long, but the light is still good for shooting. Word spreads through Springfield like wildfire. By sunset, half the town has gathered on the square's perimeter, keeping a respectful distance from what everyone knows will be a killing ground. You position yourself behind a water trough where you can see everything but stay out of the line of fire. Your notebook is ready, your pencil sharp. This is the story that will make your career if you live to write it. Hickok appears first, walking down the middle of the street with that peculiar gunfighter's gait, slow, deliberate, his arms hanging loose at his sides, but ready. He's removed his coat, and you can see the ivory handles of his Colts gleaming against his red sash. His face might as well be carved from granite. Tut emerges from the opposite end of the square, and you notice he's wearing the contested watch, its chain draped ostentatiously across his vest. He's chosen a different approach. His gun belt sits low on his hips in the Texas style, and his hand hovers near the grip of what looks like a Colt Army revolver. The two men stop when they're roughly 75 yards apart, an impossible distance for most shooters, but these aren't most men. You've heard Hickok can put 6 shots through a playing card at 50 paces, and Tut's reputation with a pistol is nearly as fearsome. Davis! Hickok's voice echoes off the surrounding buildings. Don't you come any closer. For a moment, it seems like sanity might prevail. Tut pauses, his hand still near his gun, but not yet committed to the draw that will end everything. The crowd holds its collective breath. Even the wind seems to stop. Then Tut's hand moves toward his weapon. What you witness next happens faster than thought, but slower than nightmares. Both men draw simultaneously, their movements a blur of practiced motion. Hickok's gun clears leather first, but only by a fraction of a second. The reports of their pistols come so close together they sound like one thunderclap that rolls across the square, like God's own judgment. Tut's shot goes wide, his bullet burying itself in the courthouse wall, 20 feet to Hickok's left. Hickok's shot flies true, taking Tut in the left side just below the ribs. You watch Tut stagger, his face registering more surprise than pain. He tries to say something, but only blood comes out. The gold watch slips from his fingers as he falls, its case cracking against the stone steps of the courthouse. Hickok doesn't move for a long moment, his smoking pistol still in his hand, pointed toward where Tut had stood. When he finally holsters the weapon, his movements are steady, controlled. He walks to where Tut lies dying, kneels beside him, and gently closes his former friend's eyes. "I'm sorry it came to this, Davis," you hear him whisper. The crowd begins to disperse, their thirst for drama satisfied, but their souls somehow diminished. You remain behind your water trough, scribbling notes with shaking hands. You've just witnessed the first recorded quick-draw duel in American history, the template for every Western legend that will follow. This is the moment when the mythology of the gunfighter is born, when skill with a pistol becomes the measure of a man's worth. Later, you'll learn that Hickok was arrested for manslaughter, but acquitted after witnesses testified that Tut drew first. The jury deliberated for only 20 minutes before declaring it justifiable homicide. The judge's instructions were simple. If a man draws a gun on you, you have the right to defend yourself with deadly force. But sitting there in the gathering dusk, watching the bloodstains spread across the courthouse steps, you realize you've witnessed something more than a simple gunfight. You've seen the birth of a legend, the first chapter in a story that will define the American West for generations to come. The age of the gunfighter has begun. Let's continue with today's second story. Settle in and listen. You find yourself in Tombstone, Arizona Territory, the 25th of February, 1881. The silver mines are booming, money flows like water, and danger lurks behind every smile in every saloon. This is a town where fortunes are won and lost on the turn of a card, where professional gamblers are treated like royalty, and where a man's reputation with cards is as important as his skill with a gun. The Oriental Saloon is the crown jewel of Tombstone's gaming establishments. Its mahogany bar, imported from San Francisco, its crystal chandeliers, shipped around Cape Horn, its green felt tables, presided over by dealers whose hands move like magicians, and whose eyes miss nothing. The stakes here are higher than anywhere else in the territory, and the men who play here are the elite of their deadly profession. Luke Short stands at the far end of the Oriental's main gaming room, and even in this company he commands attention. At 29, he's already established himself as one of the most feared gamblers in the American West. He's short, barely 5'6" in his custom-made boots, but what he lacks in stature, he more than makes up for in deadly skill with both cards and guns. His black hair is perfectly pomaded, his moustache waxed to sharp points, and his diamond stickpin catches the gaslight like a star. But it's his hands that mark him as dangerous, small, delicate, with fingers that can deal from the bottom of a deck or clear leather faster than most men can blink. Across the room, Charlie Storms leans against the faro table, his weathered face a map of every frontier town from Denver to Dodge City. Storms is old school, a survivor of the California gold rush, the Colorado mining camps, and a dozen shooting scrapes that should have killed him years ago. He's bigger than Short, 6 feet tall and broad through the shoulders, and he carries his years like battle scars. His grey beard is stained with tobacco. His coat shows the wear of 1,000 card games, and his Colt Point .45 sits in a worn holster that's seen more draws than a bank teller. The tension between these two has been building for weeks. Both men are professionals, in a profession that doesn't tolerate competition gracefully. They've been circling each other like wolves, each waiting for the other to show weakness, to make the mistake that will end everything. The trouble started over a faro game 3 nights ago. Faro was the king of gambling games in the 1882nd, a fast-paced contest of pure chance where players bet against the house on which cards would appear. It required no skill, no bluffing, no psychology, just luck and the house edge that slowly but inevitably ground down even the luckiest players. Storms had been dealing that night, his gnarled hands working the cards with the smooth efficiency of 30 years' practice. The game was running straight, the cards falling randomly, the house percentage grinding out its inevitable profit. But Short had been winning. Not just winning, but winning consistently, defying the mathematical certainties that governed every professional gambling operation. "That's quite a run of luck you're having there, Short," Storms had said, his voice carefully neutral, but his eyes hard as flint. Short had looked up from his growing stack of chips, his pale eyes meeting Storms's gaze without flinching. "Luck has nothing to do with it, Charlie. Some men are just born to win." The implication hung in the air like gunsmoke. In the gambling fraternity, there was no greater insult than the suggestion of cheating, no faster way to provoke a killing than to question a man's honesty at cards. Storm's hand had moved involuntarily toward his gun, but the moment passed. Other games continued, other dealers worked their tables, and the Oriental's business went on as usual. But everyone in the room knew that words had been spoken that could not be taken back. Now, 3 nights later, you watch the final act play out with the terrible inevitability of a Greek tragedy. Short has just finished a profitable evening at the poker table, his winnings tucked safely in a leather poke that bulges with gold coins and paper money. He's preparing to leave, adjusting his coat, checking his pocket watch, a beautiful Patek Philippe that cost more than most men earn in a year. Storms pushes himself away from the faro table, his spurs chiming against the hardwood floor as he crosses the room. The Oriental's usual din, the clink of glasses, the shuffle of cards, the murmur of conversation, gradually fades as patrons notice what's happening. Even the piano player's hands slow on the keys, the melody dying away to nothing. Short, Storm's voice cuts through the silence like a blade. "I believe we have some unfinished business." Luke Short turns slowly, his movements controlled and deliberate. He's faced this moment before in a dozen frontier towns, and he knows exactly how it will end. His right hand hangs loose at his side, inches from the pearl-handled Colt that has made him famous from Kansas to California. "I don't recall any business between us, Charlie," Short says, his voice soft but carrying clearly in the suddenly quiet room. "Unless you're referring to your unfortunate run of luck the other night." Storm's face flushes red above his grey beard. "Luck? That's what you call it?" His voice rises, carrying the accumulated frustration of a man who's watched his profession change, who's seen young guns like Short reshape the rules of a game he's played since before the Civil War. "I've been dealing cards since you were in short pants, boy. I know luck when I see it, and I know something else when I see it too." The accusation hangs in the air like a thundercloud. Every man in the Oriental knows what Storms is suggesting, and every man knows that such words can only end in blood. Short's eyes narrow to pale slits, and you see his weight shift almost imperceptibly, settling into the gunfighter's crouch you've witnessed in too many saloons. "Charlie," Short says, his voice now carrying an edge like a razor, "you'd better be very careful about what you're implying." But Storms has gone too far to back down now. Pride, whiskey, and 30 years of frontier justice have combined to push him past the point of no return. His hand drops toward his gun, not fast, but with grim determination. "I'm not implying anything, Short. I'm saying it plain." He never gets to finish the sentence. Short's draw is the fastest thing you've ever seen, a blur of motion that seems to defy the laws of physics. His Colt clears leather and fires 3 times before Storms can fully grip his own weapon. The reports echo through the Oriental like cannon fire, and gun smoke drifts across the room in lazy clouds. Storms stands for a moment, a look of profound surprise on his weathered face. 3 red flowers bloom across the front of his shirt, spreading slowly through the fabric. His hand releases his gun, letting it fall back into its holster unfired. He takes 1 step backward, then another, before his knees give out and he crumples to the floor like a marionette with cut strings. Short stands over the dying man, his smoking pistol still in his hand but already beginning to lower. There's no satisfaction in his pale eyes, no triumph, just the cold professionalism of a man who's done what necessity demanded. He holsters his weapon with the same fluid motion he used to draw it, then kneels beside Storms and checks for a pulse. Finding none, he closes the dead man's eyes and stands, brushing dust from his knees. "Gentlemen," he says to the room at large, his voice carrying no more emotion than if he were discussing the weather, "this man accused me of cheating at cards. Such an accusation could not go unanswered." He adjusts his coat, checks his pocket watch, and heads toward the door. "Good evening to you all." As Short disappears into the tombstone night, you remain in the Oriental, staring at Charlie Storm's body and scribbling notes with hands that still shake from what you've witnessed. This wasn't like the Hickok Tut duel, with its formal challenge and public setting. This was frontier justice at its most brutal and efficient. A man insulted, honour demanded satisfaction, and satisfaction delivered with 3 bullets and surgical precision. Later, you'll learn that no charges were filed. Bat Masterson, who witnessed the entire confrontation, testified that Storms drew first and that Short acted in self-defense. The tombstone epitaph will run a brief notice about Storm's death, mentioning his long career as a gambler and his reputation for honesty. There will be no mention of his final accusation, no suggestion that he died for anything less than honourable reasons. But you know the truth. Charlie Storms died because he couldn't accept that the West was changing, that young men like Luke Short were writing new rules for old games. He died because pride and whiskey convinced him to make an accusation he couldn't prove against a man who wouldn't tolerate doubt about his honesty. Most of all, he died because in the frontier's harsh arithmetic, being wrong was often fatal, and being slow was always so. The Oriental Saloon returns to its normal rhythm within minutes. New dealers take their places, fresh games begin, and money changes hands with the relentless efficiency of a machine designed to separate fools from their fortunes. But you remain at your corner table, nursing a whiskey, and thinking about the thin line between reputation and death, in a place where both can be lost faster than a man can draw his gun. Let's move to our third story. Get comfortable and listen closely. You're in Abilene, Kansas, August 1871, at the height of the cattle driving season. This is the end of the Chisholm Trail, where Texas Longhorns by the thousands are loaded onto railroad cars, bound for eastern markets. The town swells with cowboys, who've spent months on the trail with nothing but beans, hardtack, and each other for company. Now they have money in their pockets, civilization at their fingertips, and 3 months of pent-up energy to burn. The Alamo Saloon sits at the heart of Abilene's entertainment district, its batwing doors swinging constantly as cowboys, gamblers, buffalo hunters, and railroad workers flow in and out like a human tide. The air inside is thick with tobacco smoke, cheap perfume, and the sweat of men who've travelled 1,000 miles for this moment. A Mexican guitar player sits in the corner, his fingers dancing over strings that sing of distant homelands and lost loves. At a corner table sits the most dangerous man in Texas, and possibly America. John Wesley Hardin is only 18 years old, but he's already killed more men than most soldiers see in a war. He's been running from the law since he was 15, when he killed his first man in a schoolyard argument that escalated to gunplay. Since then, the body count has grown. Some say 15 men. Others claim 25, and Hardin himself has lost count. He doesn't look like death incarnate. Standing barely 5'9" and weighing perhaps 160 pounds, Hardin appears almost delicate in his fine clothes. A black wool suit, white shirt with a boiled collar, and a silk cravat held in place by a diamond stickpin. His face is clean-shaven and handsome, with dark hair that curls at his collar and intelligent brown eyes that seem to take in everything at once. But it's his hands that mark him as something other than human pale, slender fingers that can perform miracles of speed and precision with the twin Colts he wears in a most unusual fashion. Those guns hang in holsters positioned butts forward at his waist, a configuration that looks awkward to anyone unfamiliar with Hardin's particular method of drawing. This is the border shift or cavalry draw, a technique that allows a man to cross-draw both weapons simultaneously, filling each hand with deadly iron in a motion faster than most men can draw a single gun. Hardin perfected this technique through thousands of hours of practice until drawing and firing became as natural as breathing. Tonight, he's playing poker with a mixed group of cowboys, gamblers, and local toughs, his pile of gold eagles and silver dollars growing steadily as the evening progresses. Hardin is as skilled with cards as he is with guns, possessed of a mathematical mind that can calculate odds and read faces with equal precision. He plays conservatively, never betting more than he can afford to lose, never showing emotion whether he wins or loses. Across the table sits Jim Bradley, a local tough who's built his reputation by backing down cowboys and intimidating visitors. Bradley is everything Hardin is, not big, loud, crude, with hands like ham hocks and a face that's been rearranged by too many barroom brawls. He wears his gun low on his right hip in the traditional fast-draw style, and he's been drinking steadily since sunset, his voice growing louder and his temper shorter with each shot of whiskey. The pot has grown to over $200 more money than most men see in 6 months when Bradley makes his play. He's holding 3 jacks, a strong hand in any company, and he's convinced that the quiet young man across from him is bluffing. "I'll see your 20 and raise you 50, Bradley announces, pushing a stack of gold coins into the center of the table with a flourish that sends several smaller coins scattering across the green felt. Hardin studies his cards with the same intense concentration he brings to everything. He's holding a full house 3 queens over 2 tens, a hand that beats Bradley's jacks but could lose to 4 of a kind or a straight flush. The odds are in his favor, but poker is a game where mathematics meets psychology, and he's learned to read both the cards and the men who play them. "I'll see your 50 and raise you another 100, Hardin says quietly, counting out gold coins with the same precise movements he uses for everything else. Bradley's face flushes red above his beard. $200 represents nearly everything he has in the world, and something in Hardin's calm demeanor suggests that the young man isn't bluffing. But Bradley has built his reputation on never backing down, never showing weakness, never letting anyone, especially a Texas teenager, push him around. "You're trying to buy the pot, boy," Bradley snarls, his words slurred by whiskey and anger. "Think you can scare off old Jim Bradley with your daddy's money?" The insult hangs in the air, like gunsmoke. Every man at the table knows that calling someone boy is fighting words in cowboy society, a challenge to masculinity that can only be answered with violence. Hardin's dark eyes never leave Bradley's face, but something changes in their depths. A coldness that suggests winter winds and grave dirt. "Mr. Bradley," Hardin says, his voice soft but carrying clearly in the suddenly quiet saloon, "you'd better watch your tongue. I'm not my daddy, and this isn't his money." Bradley laughs, a harsh sound that carries no humour. "Is that so? Well then, maybe you'd like to prove you're man enough to play with the grown-ups." He reaches for his gun, not to draw, but to rest his hand threateningly on the grip. "Maybe we should settle this like men instead of hiding behind cards." The challenge is explicit now, and every man in the Alamo knows what happens next. Hardin sets his cards face down on the table and slowly pushes his chair back, his movements controlled and deliberate. His hands hang loose at his sides, but you notice how his fingers flex slightly, limbering up for the draw that will decide everything. If that's what you want, Mr. Bradley, I'm ready to accommodate you. Bradley stands first, his chair scraping against the wooden floor with a sound like fingernails on a coffin lid. He's bigger than Hardin, stronger, with a longer reach, and more experience in barroom brawls. But as he looks into the young man's eyes, something cold touches his heart, a premonition that he's made a terrible mistake. Hardin rises from his chair with fluid grace, stepping away from the table to give himself room to work. The other players scatter like leaves before a storm, overturning chairs in their haste to clear the line of fire. Even the guitar player stops his music, his fingers frozen over strings that no longer sing. "Whenever you're ready, Mr. Bradley," Hardin says, his voice carrying no more emotion than if he were asking about the weather. Bradley's hand drops toward his gun, but he hesitates for just a moment, perhaps remembering stories he's heard about this quiet young man, perhaps finally realizing the magnitude of what he's started. That hesitation costs him everything. Hardin's draw is supernatural, a blur of motion that seems to violate the laws of physics. His hands cross his body in a motion too fast to follow, the twin Colts seeming to appear in his palms as if by magic. The right-hand gun fires first, its bullet taking Bradley in the chest just below the heart. The left-hand gun fires a split second later, its shot striking Bradley in the throat and ending any chance he might have had to return fire. Bradley staggers backward, his own gun only halfway out of its holster, his eyes wide with the terrible understanding that comes to all men in their final moments. He tries to speak, but only blood comes out. He takes one more step backward, crashes into the bar, and slides slowly to the floor, leaving a red smear on the mahogany. Hardin stands over the dying man for a moment, his smoking gun still in his hands, but already beginning to lower. There's no satisfaction in his dark eyes, no triumph or regret, just the cold professionalism of a man who's done what he had to do and is already thinking about what comes next. He holsters both weapons with the same fluid motion he used to draw them, then walks back to the poker table where his cards still lie face down on the green felt. Without looking at Bradley's body, he turns over his hand, revealing the full house that would have won the pot without any bloodshed. "Gentlemen," he says to the room at large, his voice steady and calm, "I believe the hand is mine." He collects his winnings methodically, counting each coin and paper bill before tucking them into his vest pockets. Then he picks up his hat, adjusts it to the proper angle, and heads for the door. As he passes Bradley's body, he pauses for just a moment. "You should have folded," he says quietly. As Hardin disappears into the Abilene night, you remain in the Alamo, staring at Jim Bradley's corpse and trying to process what you've just witnessed. This wasn't a formal duel like Hickok and Tutt, or a professional disagreement like Short and Storms. This was something more primitive and terrifying, a glimpse into the heart of a man who kills not from anger or passion, but from a cold calculation that sees death as simply another tool to be used when circumstances require it. Later, you'll learn that Hardin left Abilene that same night, riding south toward Texas, ahead of the law that was already organizing a pursuit. No charges will ever be filed. For Bradley's death, too many witnesses saw who drew first, and frontier justice is clear on such matters. But you know that another name has been added to John Wesley Hardin's growing tally, another notch on guns that have already claimed more lives than most men could count. The Alamo Saloon returns to normal within the hour. The body is removed, the blood mopped up, and fresh games begin as if nothing had happened. But you remain at your corner table, nursing a whiskey and thinking about the 18-year-old boy who kills with the precision of a surgeon and the emotion of a machine. In a territory where dangerous men are as common as tumbleweeds, you've just met the most dangerous of them all and lived to write about it. Let's continue with our fourth story. Settle back and let the tale unfold. You're in San Antonio, Texas, March 1880, in the heart of what locals call the Devil's Triangle, a 6-block area of saloons, gambling houses, and variety theatres that never truly sleeps. Gas lamps flicker in the humid night air, casting dancing shadows on wooden sidewalks worn smooth by the boots of cowboys, soldiers from Fort Sam Houston, and the endless parade of drifters, gamblers, and gun hands who make this city their temporary home. The Vaudeville Theatre stands at the corner of Commerce and Soledad Streets, its ornate facade promising entertainment that ranges from Shakespeare to burlesque, depending on the night and the audience's mood. But the real action at the Vaudeville isn't happening on stage. It's taking place in the gambling rooms upstairs, where fortunes change hands faster than cards can be shuffled, and where men's reputations are won and lost on the turn of a wheel or the fall of dice. Tonight, the theatre hosts a special performance, not of actors or singers, but of 2 men whose skills with firearms have made them legendary throughout the Southwest. One is Ben Thompson, perhaps the most feared gunman in Texas, a man whose mathematical mind and surgeon's precision with a pistol have earned him a reputation that extends from the Rio Grande to the Canadian border. The other is Jack Harris, owner of the Vaudeville, and a man who's built his empire on the principle that in his establishment his word is law and his gun is the final arbiter of all disputes. Ben Thompson sits at a corner table in the Vaudeville's main gambling room, his pale blue eyes scanning the room with the systematic attention of a man who survived 30 years on the frontier by never assuming anything is safe. At 38, Thompson is in his prime. Not the fastest gun in the West, perhaps, but certainly the most accurate. Where other men rely on speed, Thompson depends on precision, able to place a bullet exactly where he wants it with mathematical certainty. He's dressed in his customary black suit, white shirt, and string tie, his appearance more befitting a banker or lawyer than a gunfighter. His moustache is perfectly waxed, his hair parted with geometric precision, and his hands, those deadly instruments that have ended more lives than anyone can count, are soft and white as a woman's. But beneath his civilized exterior lurks something cold and calculating, a mind that can compute odds and angles with the precision of a surveyor and the ruthlessness of an executioner. Thompson has come to the Vaudeville tonight not for entertainment, but for business. He's interested in acquiring a stake in San Antonio's gambling operations, and Jack Harris's establishment is the crown jewel of the city's gaming industry. But Harris has made it clear that Thompson's money isn't welcome, not because he doubts Thompson's ability to pay, but because he fears what Thompson's reputation might do to the Vaudeville's carefully cultivated atmosphere of civilized vice. Across the room, Jack Harris holds court at the main faro table, his booming voice carrying over the general din as he banters with players and spectators. Harris is everything. Thompson is not tall, robust, gregarious, with the bearing of a man who's never met a stranger or backed down from a fight. He built the Vaudeville from nothing, transforming a simple saloon into San Antonio's premier entertainment destination through a combination of shrewd business sense, political connections, and a willingness to use violence when necessary. But Harris has made a crucial miscalculation. He's treated Thompson not as a potential business partner, but as a threat to be eliminated, and in doing so, he's guaranteed that elimination will be the only possible outcome of their relationship. The confrontation begins as these things often do, with a seemingly innocent question. Thompson approaches Harris's faro table during a lull in the action, his movements casual and unhurried. The other players instinctively give him room, recognizing something predatory in his approach. "Good evening, Mr. Harris," Thompson says, his voice carrying the soft drawl of East Texas, mixed with the precision of a man who spent years in courtrooms and legislative chambers. "I wonder if I might have a word with you about a business proposition." Harris looks up from his cards, his face hardening as he recognizes his unwelcome visitor. "I thought I made it clear, Thompson. The vaudeville isn't for sale, and I don't need any partners." Thompson's smile doesn't reach his pale eyes. "Oh, I'm not interested in buying the vaudeville, Mr. Harris. I'm interested in buying into San Antonio's gaming operations more generally, but I understand that requires your approval." The challenge is subtle but unmistakable. Harris has positioned himself as the unofficial regulator of San Antonio's gambling industry, deciding who can operate and who cannot based on his personal whims and business interests. Thompson is challenging that authority, questioning Harris's right to act as gatekeeper to the city's most lucrative enterprises. "That's right," Harris says, his voice rising slightly, "and you don't have it. I don't want your kind of trouble in my city." Thompson's smile widens, but the temperature in the room seems to drop 10 degrees. "My kind of trouble, Mr. Harris? And what kind might that be?" "The kind that ends with good men dead and businesses burned," Harris replies, his hand moving closer to the Smith & Wesson at his hip. "I've heard about Austin, Thompson. I know what happened to your enemies there." The reference to Austin touches a nerve that Thompson keeps carefully hidden beneath his civilized exterior. 2 years ago, in the state capital, Thompson had been involved in a complex web of political corruption, gambling disputes, and personal vendettas that ended with several men dead and Thompson fleeing the city ahead of murder charges. Harris is suggesting that Thompson brings chaos wherever he goes, that his very presence is a cancer that destroys everything it touches. "Austin was a misunderstanding," Thompson says, his voice still soft but carrying an edge like a razor. "I was exonerated of all charges, as I'm sure you know. Sometimes good men die because they make poor choices about their enemies. The threat is explicit now, and everyone in the gambling room recognizes it. The steady click of chips and whisper of cards gradually fades as players become aware that they're witnessing something more dangerous than any game of chance. Even the piano player in the corner lets his melody trail off into silence. Harris stands slowly from his chair, his considerable bulk casting a long shadow across the green felt table. He's bigger than Thompson, stronger, with longer reach, and what he believes is superior experience in face-to-face confrontations. But as he looks into Thompson's pale eyes, he sees something that gives him pause, not fear or anger, but a cold mathematical assessment that seems to be calculating angles, distances, and probabilities with mechanical precision. "Are you threatening me in my own establishment, Thompson?" "I don't make threats, Mr. Harris. I make statements of fact." Thompson's right hand hangs loose at his side, inches from the ivory-handled Colt that has made him famous throughout the Southwest. "The fact is, I'm going to operate gaming establishments in San Antonio. The question is whether I do so with your cooperation or over your dead body." The choice is stark, brutal in its simplicity. Harris can back down, acknowledging Thompson's superiority and allowing him to establish his operations in the city. Or he can fight, knowing that such a fight can only end with one of them dead on the vaudeville's expensive carpet. Pride, whiskey, and 30 years of frontier success combine to make Harris's choice for him. His hand drops toward his gun, not fast, but with the grim determination of a man who's decided that death is preferable to public humiliation. He never clears leather. Thompson's draw is a masterpiece of controlled violence, as precise and calculated as an engineer's blueprint. His Colt appears in his hand as if by teleportation, the barrel aligning with Harris's chest with mathematical certainty. The single shot that follows echoes through the gambling room like the crack of doom, and Harris staggers backward, his face wearing an expression of profound surprise. The bullet has struck him just below the heart, angled upward to avoid the ribs, and pierced the vital organs with surgical precision. It's a shot that requires not just speed, but perfect understanding of human anatomy, the kind of accuracy that comes from years of study and practice. Harris tries to draw his own weapon, but his strength is fading fast. He manages to pull the Smith & Wesson halfway from its holster before his knees give out and he crashes to the floor. Thompson stands over the dying man, his smoking pistol held steady but already beginning to lower. There's no emotion in his pale eyes, no satisfaction or regret. Just the cold professionalism of a man who's solved a problem through the application of superior firepower and precise marksmanship. "Gentlemen," Thompson says to the room at large, his voice carrying no more feeling than if he were discussing a hand of poker. "Mr. Harris has withdrawn his objection to my business operations in San Antonio." He holsters his weapon with the same fluid motion he used to draw it, then straightens his coat and checks his pocket watch. "I trust there will be no further obstacles to my establishing gaming houses in this fine city." The response is immediate and unanimous. Every gambling operator, saloon keeper, and vice entrepreneur in the room nods his agreement, understanding that they've just witnessed a changing of the guard in San Antonio's criminal hierarchy. Ben Thompson is now the undisputed king of the city's gaming operations. His authority, established not through negotiation or political maneuvering, but through superior skill with a firearm. As Thompson collects his hat and heads for the door, he pauses beside Harris's body long enough to close the dead man's eyes, a gesture of respect that somehow makes the killing even more chilling in its calculated precision. "Nothing personal, Jack," he says quietly, "just business." The vaudeville theatre continues its evening's entertainment, but the real performance is over. You remain in your corner, scribbling notes and trying to process what you've just witnessed. This wasn't a barroom brawl or a crime of passion. It was an execution carried out with the precision of a surgeon and the cold calculation of an accountant. Later, you'll learn that no charges were filed against Thompson. Too many witnesses saw Harris draw first, and Texas law is clear about a man's right to defend himself. Thompson will go on to operate his gaming establishments in San Antonio for several years, building a criminal empire that extends throughout South Texas, before finally meeting his own end in a hail of bullets at the hands of King Fisher's associates. But tonight, in the aftermath of Jack Harris's death, you're witnessing the birth of a legend. Not the fastest gun in the West, perhaps, but certainly the most precise. A man who kills not from anger or passion, but from the cold mathematical certainty that some problems can only be solved with lead and steel. The age of the scientific gunfighter has begun. Let's move to our fifth story. Make yourself comfortable and listen. You're in the wilderness of southern Wyoming Territory, July 1869, at mile marker 847 of the Union Pacific Railroad. This is the leading edge of American civilization, a temporary city of canvas tents, wooden shanties, and iron determination that moves westward at the rate of 2 miles per day. The Transcontinental Railroad is racing toward completion, and every mile of track represents a triumph of human will over impossible geography, hostile weather, and the constant threat of Indian attack. The camp spreads across a wind-swept valley like a military encampment, which, in many ways, its island. Over 3,000 men live here. Irish immigrants fleeing poverty and famine, Chinese workers recruited from the gold fields of California, former Union and Confederate soldiers still fighting their war through different means, and freed slaves seeking their fortune in a land that promises equality, if not always delivering it. At the center of this organized chaos stands the camp's most important building, not the superintendent's office or the telegraph station, but McCarthy's saloon, a ramshackle structure of pine boards and canvas that serves as the social center for men who spend 12 hours a day breaking their backs in service to progress. The whiskey is raw, the beer is warm, and the company is rough. But for men who sleep on the ground and eat beans for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, McCarthy's represents the pinnacle of luxury. Tonight, the saloon is more crowded than usual because word has spread throughout the camp that two of the crew's most notorious characters are going to settle their differences in a manner that's already becoming the stuff of legend. Patrick Casey and Sean McGillicuddy represent everything that's both magnificent and terrible about the men building America's railroad. They're strong as bulls, brave as lions, and stubborn as mules, with tempers that ignite faster than black powder and pride that burns hotter than the forges where their tools are made. Casey sits at a corner table, his massive frame dwarfing the rough-hewn chair beneath him. At 6'4" and 240 pounds, he's built like the steam locomotives he helps guide across the continent, all power and momentum, with very little in the way of stopping mechanisms. His red hair falls to his shoulders, his beard is shot through with premature grey from years of hard labour, and his hands are scarred monuments to every mile of track he's helped lay from Nebraska to this godforsaken valley in Wyoming. He's what the railroad calls a Gandhi dancer, a track layer who swings a 16-pound sledgehammer 10 hours a day, driving spikes through iron rails into wooden ties with mechanical precision. It's work that builds muscles like steel cables and destroys everything else, leaving men old before their time and broken long before they're ready to quit. But Casey has survived 15 years of railroad construction, working his way west from the Mississippi River through country that would challenge an army, and he's earned the respect that comes from being the best at a job that kills lesser men. Across the saloon, Sean McGillicuddy leans against the bar, his pale green eyes fixed on Casey with the intensity of a man who's made peace with his own mortality. McGillicuddy is smaller than Casey, only 6 feet tall and perhaps 200 pounds. But what he lacks in size, he makes up for in pure, concentrated fury. He's got the lean build of a man who's spent his life fighting gravity, hauling iron rails up impossible grades and across bridges that span chasms deep enough to swallow churches. McGillicuddy works as a iron man, one of the specialised labourers who carries the 700-pound steel rails from supply trains to the advancing railhead. It requires not just strength, but perfect timing and coordination, since a dropped rail can crush a man's foot or leg as easily as a falling tree. He's been working the railroads since he was 16, following the construction crews from one impossible project to the next, and he's developed the kind of focused intensity that comes from knowing that one moment of inattention can end everything. The trouble between these two titans began 3 weeks ago with the arrival of Molly O'Brien, a camp follower who combined remarkable beauty with a sharp business sense that allowed her to separate railroad workers from their wages with remarkable efficiency. Molly wasn't a prostitute in the traditional sense. She was more of an entertainer, singer, and professional companion who provided lonely men with the illusion of female companionship in exchange for gifts, drinks, and whatever small luxuries she could accumulate. Both Casey and McGillicuddy had fallen under Molly's spell, competing for her attention with increasingly elaborate displays of strength, generosity, and masculine prowess. Casey had presented her with a gold locket he'd won in a card game, while McGillicuddy had given her a silk scarf imported from San Francisco at considerable expense. The rivalry might have remained friendly competition if not for the incident that occurred last Saturday night. Casey had been entertaining Molly with stories of his railroad adventures when McGillicuddy approached their table, slightly drunk and considerably more bold than usual. "Molly, darling," McGillicuddy had said, his Irish accent thick with whiskey and emotion, "you're wasting your time with this old bull. A woman of your refinement deserves a man who can appreciate her finer qualities." Casey had looked up from his drink, his blue eyes hardening like winter ice. "Sean McGillicuddy, you'd best watch your tongue when you're speaking about a lady in my company." "Your company?" McGillicuddy had laughed, but there was no humour in the sound. "The lady chooses her own company, and I'm thinking she might prefer a man who doesn't smell like a barnyard." The insult hung in the air like gun smoke. In the rough democracy of the railroad camps, questioning a man's personal hygiene was tantamount to calling him unfit for civilized society. A deadly serious accusation among men who took pride in maintaining their dignity despite the primitive conditions under which they lived. Casey had stood slowly from his chair, his massive frame unfolding like a piece of heavy machinery coming to life. "Mr. McGillicuddy, I believe you owe the lady an apology for your crude language, and me an explanation for your insults." McGillicuddy had risen to meet him, and for a moment it seemed like the confrontation would end right there, two giants settling their differences with fists in the traditional manner of men who solve their problems through direct action. But Molly O'Brien had intervened, placing herself between them with the practiced skill of a woman who'd seen too many good men destroy themselves over her attention. "Gentlemen," she'd said, her voice carrying the musical lilt that made strong men weak, "surely two such fine specimens of manhood can settle their differences without resorting to violence in my presence." Both men had backed down, their respect for feminine sensibilities overriding their desire for immediate satisfaction. But the challenge had been issued and accepted, and everyone in the camp knew that some form of resolution was inevitable. Now, 3 weeks later, that resolution is at hand. The entire camp has gathered at McCarthy's saloon to witness what's already being called the most unusual duel in railroad history. Because Casey and McGillicuddy, in consultation with the camp's informal council of elders, have decided to settle their differences, not with guns, neither man is particularly skilled with firearms, but with the tools of their trade. Each man will be armed with a 16-pound railroad hammer, the same tool they use every day to drive spikes through iron rails. The fight will continue until one man yields, is unable to continue, or is dead. There will be no referee, no rules beyond the basic understanding that the last man standing wins everything, including Molly O'Brien's hand in whatever form of marriage is possible in a place where civilization is still a work in progress. You watch from a safe distance as the two giants prepare for battle. Casey swings his hammer in slow, measured arcs, limbering up shoulders and arms that are already conditioned by years of hard labour. His movements are methodical, calculated, like a machine warming up for a long day's work. McGillicuddy, by contrast, seems to vibrate with nervous energy, his hammer whistling through the air in complex patterns that suggest a man more comfortable with speed than power. The crowd forms a rough circle around the combatants, railroad workers pressed shoulder to shoulder in the saloon's cramped interior. Money changes hands as bets are placed. Casey is the favourite due to his size advantage, but McGillicuddy's supporters point to his speed and reach. Even the Chinese workers, normally kept separate from their Irish counterparts by language and cultural barriers, have gathered to witness this spectacle of American masculinity. Molly O'Brien stands at the bar, her face pale but her eyes bright, with the kind of excitement that comes from being the centre of attention in a drama that will be talked about for decades. She's dressed in her finest, a green silk dress that probably cost more than most men earn in a month. Her red hair pinned up in elaborate curls that frame her face like a portrait. She's beautiful enough to start wars, and tonight she has. The fight begins without ceremony or formal announcement. Casey simply raises his hammer and charges, his massive frame covering the distance between him and McGillicuddy in 3 quick steps. His overhead swing carries enough force to drive a railroad spike completely through a wooden tie, and if it had connected, it would have ended the fight immediately. But McGillicuddy proves that speed can triumph over power, at least temporarily. He sidesteps Casey's charge with the fluid grace of a dancer, then brings his own hammer around in a vicious arc aimed at Casey's ribs. The blow connects with a sound like an axe striking oak, and Casey staggers sideways, his face registering surprise as much as pain. The crowd roars its approval, voices raised in a dozen languages, as men who spend their days in back-breaking labour witness an exhibition of strength and skill that represents the pinnacle of their profession. This isn't just a fight over a woman, it's a celebration of everything that makes these men special, a demonstration of the physical prowess that's carving civilization out of wilderness, 1 mile at a time. Casey recovers quickly, his years of experience teaching him to absorb punishment and keep working. He swings his hammer in a horizontal arc that forces McGillicuddy to duck, then follows up with an uppercut that whistles past his opponent's chin with inches to spare. The crowd presses closer, sensing that despite its unusual weapons, this fight will be as brutal and decisive as any gunfight in the annals of Western legend. For 10 minutes, the two giants circle each other like medieval knights, their hammers singing through the smoky air with deadly precision. Casey's strategy is simply use his superior strength and weight to wear down his opponent, accepting punishment while delivering devastating blows that accumulate damage over time. McGillicuddy relies on speed and technique, dancing around Casey's powerful swings while landing quick strikes to vulnerable spots. Both strategies work, to a point. Casey's massive blows, when they connect, shake McGillicuddy to his bones, and you can see the cumulative effect wearing him down. But McGillicuddy's speed allows him to land 3 or 4 strikes for every one of Casey's, and the bigger man is beginning to show signs of fatigue as blood trickles from cuts on his forehead and arms. The turning point comes when McGillicuddy, growing confident from his success, attempts an overhead blow similar to Casey's opening attack. But he's forgotten that Casey didn't survive 15 years of railroad construction by being slow to learn from his mistakes. As McGillicuddy's hammer descends, Casey steps inside the arc of the swing and drives his own weapon upward, catching his opponent just below the sternum with enough force to lift him off his feet. McGillicuddy flies backward, crashes into the bar, and slides to the floor, his hammer falling from nerveless fingers. For a moment, it seems like the fight is over, but McGillicuddy proves that Irish stubbornness is more powerful than physics, forcing himself to his feet and retrieving his weapon, despite the obvious agony of his injuries. "Is that all you've got, Casey?" he gasps, blood trickling from the corner of his mouth. "I've been hit harder by my own grandmother." Casey grins, recognizing and respecting the courage it takes for a hurt man to continue fighting. "Sean McGillicuddy, you're either the bravest man in Wyoming or the stupidest. I haven't decided which." The fight continues for another 5 minutes, but the outcome is no longer in doubt. Casey's single devastating blow has broken something inside McGillicuddy. Perhaps ribs, perhaps something more vital, and each swing of his hammer becomes weaker, less coordinated. Casey, recognizing that his opponent is finished, begins to pull his punches slightly, delivering blows designed to end the fight without causing permanent damage. The end comes when McGillicuddy, attempting one final desperate attack, overbalances and falls to his knees. Casey's hammer descends in a controlled arc, stopping just inches from McGillicuddy's skull, close enough to demonstrate that he could deliver a killing blow, but far enough away to offer mercy to a beaten but brave opponent. "Do you yield, Sean McGillicuddy?" Casey asks, his voice surprisingly gentle for a man who's just fought with the intensity of a berserker. McGillicuddy looks up at his conqueror, blood streaking his face, but his green eyes still bright with unquenched spirit. "I yield, Patrick Casey. You're the better man with a hammer, and I'll not deny it." Casey extends his hand to help McGillicuddy to his feet, and the crowd erupts in applause for both men. This is frontier justice at its finest. Two men, settling their differences through direct action, with respect and honour maintained by both victor and vanquished. Later, you'll learn that both men survived the fight with nothing worse than bruises, cuts, and wounded pride. McGillicuddy will accept defeat gracefully, shaking Casey's hand and buying him a drink before disappearing into the Wyoming night. Casey will marry Molly O'Brien in a ceremony performed by the camp's Methodist preacher, and the couple will follow the railroad west until the transcontinental line is completed at Promontory Point, Utah. But tonight, in the aftermath of the most unusual duel in Western history, you're witnessing something more important than a simple fight over a woman. You're seeing the spirit that's building America, the willingness to fight for what matters, the courage to face impossible odds, and the strength to carve civilization out of wilderness using nothing but determination and 16-pound hammers. The age of the working man's duel has reached its apotheosis. Let's continue with our sixth story. Settle in and prepare for a tale of faith and firepower. You're in Deadwood, Dakota territory on a crisp Sunday morning in October 1876. The Black Hills gold rush is in full swing, and this ramshackle collection of tents, shanties, and hastily constructed buildings has become the most lawless town in America. Murder is so common that the local newspaper has stopped reporting individual killings, instead running weekly tallies like baseball scores. The town cemetery grows daily, its residents including Wild Bill Hickok, who was shot dead just 2 months ago while playing poker at the Number 10 Saloon. But even in this godless place, someone has to minister to the spiritual needs of the miners, gamblers, and desperados who call Deadwood home. That someone is the Reverend Joshua Manning, a Methodist circuit preacher who arrived in town 3 months ago with nothing but a Bible, a Colt 45, and an unshakable faith that the Lord works in mysterious ways, sometimes through prayer, sometimes through superior marksmanship. Manning stands at the makeshift pulpit of Deadwood's only church, a converted gambling hall that still smells of tobacco smoke and spilled whiskey, despite 3 months of dedicated effort to sanctify the premises. At 35, he's a striking figure tall, lean, with prematurely grey hair and pale blue eyes that seem to burn with inner fire. His black wool suit is carefully maintained despite the frontier conditions. His white collar is always perfectly starched, and his hands are soft enough to suggest a man of learning rather than labour. But those who know Manning's history understand that his soft hands conceal harder truths. Before answering the call to preach, he served as a Union cavalry officer during the Civil War, riding with units that specialized in what military euphemistically called irregular operations raids behind enemy lines, guerrilla warfare, and the kind of close quarters fighting that separated the living from the dead in the space of a heartbeat. He learned to shoot not from books or target practice, but from men who were trying to kill him, and that education has served him well on the frontier. This morning's congregation is typical for Deadwood. A mixed collection of miners with gold dust still under their fingernails, saloon girls in their most conservative dresses, gamblers who've been up all night and are using the service to catch a few hours of sleep, and a scattering of businessmen who attend church more for social reasons than spiritual ones. It's not the kind of congregation that would feel comfortable in a Boston cathedral. But Manning has learned to appreciate the honest sinfulness of men who don't pretend to be better than they are. He's midway through his sermon, a rousing condemnation of greed, violence, and moral corruption that could apply to half the men in his congregation, when the church door swings open with enough force to rattle the hinges. The man who enters moves with the swagger of someone who's never been seriously challenged, his expensive clothes and elaborate gun rig marking him as one of Deadwood's more successful predators. James Deacon Jim Carver earned his nickname not through any religious calling, but through his habit of wearing a black suit and quoting scripture while robbing stagecoaches, claim jumping, and murdering anyone who stood between him and easy money. At 6'2" and 220 pounds, he's an imposing figure with dead black eyes and a smile that suggests a shark contemplating dinner. His reputation extends throughout the Black Hills as a man who kills for pleasure as much as profit, and whose presence in any community inevitably leads to an increase in both crime and cemetery occupancy. Deacon Jim saunters down the centre aisle of the converted gambling hall, his spurs chiming against the wooden floor with each step. The congregation parts before him like the Red Sea, miners and businessmen alike recognizing that they're in the presence of something genuinely dangerous. He takes a seat in the front row, directly in front of Manning's pulpit, and fixes the preacher with a stare that has intimidated braver men than most frontier ministers. Manning continues his sermon without missing a beat, but you notice his right hand drift slightly closer to the gun belt concealed beneath his coat. He's been expecting this confrontation ever since arriving in Deadwood, knowing that his efforts to bring civilization to the town would eventually put him at odds with men who profit from chaos. As I was saying, brothers and sisters, Manning's voice carries clearly through the small church, each word precisely enunciated in the manner of a man accustomed to command. The Lord has given us free will, and with that gift comes the responsibility to choose between good and evil, between the path of righteousness and the road to damnation. Deacon Jim laughs, a harsh sound that cuts through the morning air like a knife. Is that so, preacher? Well, I've been choosing evil for nigh on 20 years now, and it's treated me pretty well. Got myself a fine horse, good guns, and enough gold to buy whatever I want. He stands slowly, his hand resting casually on the grip of the ivory-handled Colt at his hip. Makes a man wonder if your God is paying attention, don't it? The congregation freezes, recognizing that they're witnessing something more dangerous than any sermon. Children instinctively move closer to their parents, while the adults calculate distances to doors and windows. This is how trouble starts in Deadwood, with words that escalate to violence faster than most men can draw breath. Manning sets his Bible on the pulpit with deliberate care, his pale eyes never leaving Deacon Jim's face. Mr. Carver, you're welcome in this church, same as any sinner seeking redemption. But I'll ask you to show proper respect for the Lord's house and the people gathered here in his name. Respect? Deacon Jim's voice rises, carrying the mock outrage of a man who's never shown genuine emotion. Preacher, the only thing I respect is strength. And I'm looking at a man who hides behind fairy tales and false promises, asking good folks to give him money so he can tell them bedtime stories about heaven and hell. The accusation hangs in the air like gun smoke. In frontier society, calling a man a fraud or swindler is tantamount to challenging his honour. and honour is the one thing that even circuit preachers are expected to defend with their lives if necessary. Manning's congregation watches in fascination and terror, understanding that they're about to witness something that will become part of Deadwood legend. Manning steps out from behind the pulpit, his movements controlled and deliberate. As he walks, his coat falls open slightly, revealing the Colt Coles 45 that rides in a shoulder holster beneath his left arm, positioned for a cross draw that allows a man to reach his weapon while appearing to be adjusting his coat or vest. "Mr. Carver," Manning's voice carries the authority he once used to command cavalry troops in combat. "I've spent 10 years bringing the word of God to places where decent folks fear to tread. I've buried good men killed by bad ones, married couples who thought they'd never live to see their wedding day, and baptized children in water blessed by their parents' tears. If that makes me a fraud, then I'll wear the label proudly." Deacon Jim grins, sensing that he's successfully provoked the confrontation he's been seeking. "Pretty words, preacher, but words don't make a man. Let's see if you've got the sand to back up all that talk about righteousness triumphing over evil." The challenge is explicit now, and every person in the church understands what happens next. This isn't just a dispute between two men. It's a test of faith itself, a demonstration of whether good can triumph over evil when both are armed with Colt 45 second and the willingness to use them. "If that's what it takes to protect my flock from wolves like you," Manning says quietly, "then so be it. But we'll settle this outside, away from decent folks who've come here seeking peace." The two men walk toward the church door, their footsteps echoing in the sudden silence. The congregation follows at a respectful distance, understanding that they're about to witness something that will be talked about for decades. Word spreads through Deadwood with supernatural speed, and by the time Manning and Deacon Jim emerge onto the muddy main street, half the town has gathered to watch. They face each other in front of the church, 20 paces apart in the classic gunfighter's stance. The morning sun casts long shadows across the street, and a cold wind blows down from the mountains, stirring dust devils that dance between the combatants like spirits of the unquiet dead. "Anytime you're ready, preacher," Deacon Jim calls out, his voice carrying false joviality. "Let's see if your God is faster than my Colt." Manning reaches inside his coat, ostensibly to adjust his vest, but his hand emerges holding the 45 that has served him faithfully through a decade of frontier ministry. The draw is smooth, practiced, and devastatingly fast, the product of military training refined by years of necessity. Deacon Jim's draw is equally impressive, his ivory-handled Colt appearing in his hand with the fluid grace of a professional gunfighter. For a moment, both men stand poised, their weapons aimed at each other's hearts, separated by 20 paces and the accumulated weight of their respective choices. Manning fires first, his shot echoing off the surrounding buildings like thunder. But instead of aiming for Deacon Jim's body, he targets the man's gun hand, his bullet striking the ivory grip of the Colt with mathematical precision. Deacon Jim's weapon spins away, his fingers numbed by the impact, leaving him standing defenseless in the middle of Deadwood's main street. The crowd gasps, understanding that they've witnessed something unprecedented. A gunfighter showing mercy when he could have delivered death. A demonstration of skill so superior that it transforms what should have been a killing into a lesson. Manning keeps his gun trained on Deacon Jim, but makes no move to fire again. "Mr. Carver," he says, his voice carrying clearly in the sudden silence, "the Lord works in mysterious ways. Today, He's chosen to spare your life so you might have another chance at redemption. I suggest you don't waste it." Deacon Jim stares at his empty hand, then at the preacher, who's just demonstrated that faith backed by superior marksmanship is indeed a formidable combination. For a moment, his dead black eyes show something that might be respect, or at least recognition of a superior opponent. "Preacher," he says finally, "I've been outgunned by experts, but I've never been outgunned by a man of the cloth. That was shooting like I've never seen." Manning holsters his weapon but keeps his hand near the grip, understanding that mercy without vigilance is often indistinguishable from stupidity. "It wasn't my shooting, Mr. Carver. It was divine providence, working through fallible instruments to achieve God's will." Deacon Jim retrieves his damaged Colt, examining the shattered grip with something approaching professional admiration. "Maybe so, preacher, maybe so." He looks up at Manning, and for the first time since entering the church, his smile seems genuine rather than predatory. "I reckon I'll be moving on from Deadwood. This town's getting too civilized for my taste." He touches the brim of his hat in a gesture of respect, then walks to his horse and rides out of town, leaving behind a legend that will grow with each telling. The crowd begins to disperse, but not before several miners approach Manning to shake his hand and promise more regular church attendance. Later, you'll learn that Deacon Jim kept his word, leaving the Black Hills for parts unknown and never again troubling the citizens of Deadwood. Some say he headed for Mexico. Others claim he went north to Montana. But everyone agrees that Reverend Manning's demonstration of divine marksmanship convinced him to seek easier prey elsewhere. Manning returns to his pulpit and finishes his sermon as if nothing unusual has happened. But you notice that his congregation pays closer attention to his words about good triumphing over evil. They've seen proof that faith, properly applied, can indeed move mountains, or at least move dangerous men to seek salvation elsewhere. As the service ends and the congregation files out into the Dakota sunshine, you remain in your pew, scribbling notes about what you've witnessed. This wasn't just another frontier gunfight. It was a demonstration that civilization comes in many forms, sometimes through law and order, sometimes through superior firepower, applied with surgical precision and moral authority. The age of the fighting preacher has reached its zenith in the person of Reverend Joshua Manning, a man who proves that the pen may indeed be mightier than the sword, but sometimes you need a Colt .45 to make sure people pay attention to your penmanship. Let's move to our seventh story. Get comfortable and listen to a tale that history tried to forget. You're in Kansas City, Missouri, on a crisp morning in April 1885. The city bustles with the energy of westward expansion railroad trains. Arrive hourly carrying settlers, fortune seekers, and entertainers bound for the frontier territories. Buffalo Bill Cody's Wild West show is in town for a week-long engagement, and the entire city buzzes with excitement over the spectacle of cowboys, Indians, and sharpshooting demonstrations that promise to bring the romance of the frontier to civilized audiences. Behind the scenes, however, another drama is unfolding, one that won't appear in any newspaper accounts or official histories, but one that demonstrates the complex realities of fame, gender, and violence in an America still defining itself through conflict and conquest. Annie Oakley sits in her hotel room at the Coates house, carefully cleaning the Marlin rifle that has made her the most famous female sharpshooter in America. At 25, she's already a legend, capable of shooting with an accuracy that defies belief and a showmanship that transforms marksmanship into high art. She can hit a dime tossed in the air at 30 paces, split a playing card edgewise at 20 feet, and put 6 shots through a silver dollar before it hits the ground. But Annie's fame comes with a price that few people understand. In an era when women are expected to be delicate, submissive, and decorative, her skill with firearms makes her a threat to masculine assumptions about gender and power. She's learned to navigate this dangerous territory through careful cultivation of a feminine image. She performs in elaborate dresses, uses her maiden name rather than her married name of Butler, and presents herself as a wholesome girl next door rather than the deadly accurate shooting machine she actually islanded. This morning's challenge comes from Belle Carson, a lesser-known but equally skilled marksman who's been following the Wild West show from town to town, making increasingly bold claims about his superior abilities. Carson is everything Annie is not tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of masculine swagger that frontier society automatically respects. He's built his reputation by challenging local shooters in each town the Wild West show visits, defeating them with theatrical flair that combines genuine skill with carefully calculated showmanship. But Carson has made a crucial mistake. Yesterday, in front of a crowd of Kansas City reporters and dignitaries, he made a statement that crossed the line from professional competition into personal insult. No woman, no matter how skilled, can outshoot a man when it really matters. All this fancy shooting is just circus tricks. When lives are on the line, a woman's nerves will always fail her. The statement was calculated to provoke exactly the kind of confrontation that would generate newspaper coverage and establish Carson as the preeminent shooting expert in America. But he underestimated both Annie's skill and her willingness to defend the honor of women everywhere who dare to compete in traditionally masculine domains. Now, as dawn breaks over Kansas City, Annie prepares for a confrontation that will never appear in Wild West show programs or official biographies. She's agreed to meet Carson at the city limits, away from crowds and reporters, where they can settle their differences without the theatrical elements that characterize their public performances. She loads her rifle with the methodical precision that has become second nature through years of practice. Each cartridge is examined, weighed, and seated with mathematical certainty. Her hands move with the fluid grace of a pianist, but there's nothing artistic about her preparation. This is the deadly serious business of a professional preparing for combat. A soft knock at her door interrupts her preparations. Annie? The voice belongs to Frank Butler, her husband and manager. A man whose own shooting career was eclipsed by his wife's superior abilities. You don't have to do this. Carson's just trying to make a name for himself at your expense. Annie looks up from her rifle, her brown eyes reflecting a determination that Frank recognizes from their years together on the frontier circuit. Frank, if I back down from this challenge, every man in America will think he can question my abilities without consequences. I won't let Carson's ignorance go unanswered. Frank nods, understanding that his wife's decision comes not from pride, but from necessity. In a society that questions women's capabilities at every turn, Annie must defend not just her own reputation, but the principle that skill, rather than gender, should determine worth. The meeting place is a field outside Kansas City's eastern limits, a stretch of prairie that provides clear sight lines and sufficient distance from civilian populations. Carson is already there when Annie arrives, his expensive rifle gleaming in the morning sun as he practices his draw and aim with theatrical flourishes designed to intimidate his opponent. He's dressed for the occasion in his finest frontier costume-fringed buckskin shirt, silver-studded gun belt, and a hat that's been carefully weathered to suggest years of frontier experience. Everything about his appearance is calculated to project masculine authority and frontier authenticity. Annie, by contrast, wears a simple brown dress, practical boots, and a modest hat that keeps the sun out of her eyes. She carries her rifle with the same casual confidence that other women carry parasols, and her demeanour suggests someone who's more interested in getting the job done than making theatrical statements about it. "Well, well," Carson calls out as Annie approaches, his voice carrying the kind of false joviality that suggests a man trying to convince himself of his own confidence. The little lady decided to show up after all. I was beginning to think you'd come to your senses." Annie sets her rifle butt first against the ground, her hands folded over the muzzle in a pose that suggests prayer more than preparation for combat. "Mr. Carson, I'm here to demonstrate that skill with firearms has nothing to do with gender and everything to do with practice, dedication, and natural ability." Carson laughs, but there's something forced about the sound. "Natural ability? Lady, I've been shooting since I was old enough to hold a gun. I've hunted everything from rabbits to grizzly bears, fought Indians, and outshot every man who's ever challenged me. You think playing dress-up for circus crowds prepares you for real shooting?" The terms of their confrontation are simple but demanding. They will shoot at targets placed at increasing distances, first 50 yards, then 100, then 150. Each shooter will fire 10 rounds at each distance, with accuracy determining the winner. If they remain tied after the distance shooting, they will engage in aerial targets clay pigeons thrown by hand at irregular intervals. Carson shoots first at the 50-yard target, a playing card pinned to a wooden post. His first 5 shots are excellent, grouping within the card's boundaries, with the kind of precision that confirms his reputation as a skilled marksman. His second 5 shots are equally impressive, and he steps back with obvious satisfaction. "Beat that little lady," he says, making a theatrical bow. Annie approaches the firing line with the same calm concentration she brings to every performance. Her rifle comes to her shoulder with mechanical precision, and her breathing settles into the rhythm that precedes perfect shooting. Her first shot tears through the exact center of the playing card, and her subsequent 9 shots follow with metronomic regularity, each bullet passing through the same hole with an accuracy that defies belief. When the smoke clears, Carson stares at the target in disbelief. Where his 10 shots have scattered across the playing card in a respectable but visible pattern, Annie's 10 shots have created a single, perfectly round hole in the card's center, a demonstration of accuracy so superior that it seems to violate the laws of physics. The 100-yard round produces similar results. Carson's shooting remains impressive by any normal standard, but Annie's supernatural accuracy makes his best efforts look amateur by comparison. Her 10 shots again group into a single hole, this time in the center of a silver dollar, that Carson can barely see at the increased distance. By the time they reach the 150-yard targets, Carson's confidence has evaporated entirely. His hands shake slightly as he loads his rifle, and his shots begin to scatter as the psychological pressure of competing against seemingly impossible accuracy takes its toll. Annie, by contrast, appears as calm as if she were shooting at a county fair, her rifle speaking with mechanical regularity as she places shot after shot exactly where she intends them to go. The aerial target portion of the contest is almost anticlimactic. Carson, his confidence shattered by Annie's display of precision shooting, misses 3 of his 10 clay pigeons and barely clips 2 others. Annie, shooting with the same fluid grace she displays in Wild West show performances, shatters all 10 pigeons into powder. Some of them struck multiple times before they can fall to earth. As the last echoes of gunfire fade across the Kansas prairie, Carson stands, staring at his rifle as if it had betrayed him. The weapon that has served him faithfully in dozens of competitions suddenly feels foreign in his hands, inadequate for the level of precision he's just witnessed. "I don't understand it," he says, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've never seen shooting like that. It's not human." Annie walks over to where Carson stands, her rifle cradled in her arms like a sleeping child. There's no triumph in her expression, no gloating over her victory, just the quiet satisfaction of a professional who's completed a job that needed doing. "Mr. Carson," she says, her voice gentle but firm, Shooting isn't about being a man or a woman. It's about understanding your weapon, controlling your breathing, and practicing until excellence becomes automatic. I've been doing that since I was 8 years old, and I'll keep doing it until I'm too old to hold a rifle steady. Carson nods slowly, beginning to comprehend the magnitude of his miscalculation. Miss Oakley, I owe you an apology. I spoke from ignorance and prejudice, and you've shown me the error of my ways in terms I can't argue with. Apology accepted, Mr. Carson. But I hope you'll remember this lesson when you're tempted to judge someone's abilities based on their gender rather than their demonstrated skills. Carson gathers his equipment with the defeated air of a man whose fundamental assumptions about the world have been shattered in the space of an hour. As he prepares to leave, he pauses and looks back at Annie, who's cleaning her rifle with the same methodical care she brought to the shooting contest. Miss Oakley, may I ask you something? Of course. How did you learn to shoot like that? That level of accuracy? It's beyond anything I've ever seen or heard of. Annie smiles, and for the first time that morning, her expression suggests the warmth and humour that make her beloved by Wild West show audiences. Mr. Carson, I learned to shoot because my family needed food on the table, and missing meant going hungry. When survival depends on accuracy, you develop accuracy. When you do something 10,000 times, it becomes as natural as breathing. Carson tips his hat and walks away, a humbled man whose understanding of skill and gender has been permanently altered by his encounter with the most accurate shooter in America. He will leave Kansas City that afternoon, and his boastful challenges to female shooters will never be heard again. Annie returns to town, where she rejoins the Wild West show for that evening's performance. The morning's events will never be mentioned in newspapers or official biographies, but word spreads through the shooting community with the speed of telegraph signals. By sunset, every marksman in Kansas City knows that Bell Carson, a man who'd built his reputation by defeating all challengers, was outshot so completely by Annie Oakley that he left town rather than face the humiliation of public acknowledgement. Later, you'll learn that this confrontation marks a turning point in public perception of women's capabilities with firearms. While most Americans will never hear the details of Annie's victory over Carson, the story spreads through informal networks of shooters, hunters, and firearms enthusiasts, gradually changing attitudes about gender and marksmanship. But tonight, in the aftermath of the most one-sided shooting contest in frontier history, you're witnessing something more important than a simple victory of skill over prejudice. You're seeing the birth of a new understanding that excellence recognizes no gender boundaries, and that the most dangerous assumptions are those we make about other people's limitations. The age of the female gunfighter may never arrive in the same way as its masculine counterpart, but Annie Oakley has proven that when it comes to deadly accuracy with a rifle, the only thing that matters is the ability to put bullets exactly where they need to go. Let's continue with our 8th story. Settle back and listen to a tale of tuberculosis and deadly accuracy. You're in Dodge City, Kansas, on a sweltering afternoon in July 1878. The cattle season is at its peak, and the town swells with Texas cowboys who've driven their herds north along the Western Trail to the railroad yards that will carry their beef to eastern markets. The Long Branch Saloon, Dodge City's premier watering hole, serves as the unofficial headquarters for the gamblers, gunfighters, and confidence men who follow the cattle trade like parasites following a host. At a corner table sits the most enigmatic figure in the American West Doctor, John Henry Doc Holliday, a man whose twin professions as dentist and gambler have made him legendary from Georgia to Arizona territory. At 26, Consumption has already begun its slow work of destroying his lungs, giving his pale face the translucent quality of expensive china, and his voice the whisper of autumn leaves. He coughs frequently into a silk handkerchief that's increasingly stained with the blood that marks his body's losing battle against the disease that will eventually kill him. But tuberculosis, while it's destroying Doc's body, seems to have sharpened his mind to a razor's edge. His pale grey eyes miss nothing, cataloguing every player's tell, every dealer's habit, every potential threat with the systematic attention of a man who knows that carelessness kills faster than bullets. His hands, soft and white as a surgeon's, move with deadly precision whether they're dealing cards or drawing the nickel-plated Colt that rides in a shoulder holster beneath his grey frock coat. Tonight's game is high-stakes Poker 5 card stud with $100 ante that keeps out everyone except serious players and serious fools. Doc's pile of chips has grown steadily throughout the evening, his mathematical mind calculating odds with the precision of an accountant, and his poker face revealing nothing more than mild interest in the proceedings. Across the table sits Johnny Tyler, a professional gambler whose reputation extends from the Mississippi River to the Pacific coast. Tyler is everything Doc appears, not to be robust, healthy, with the kind of florid complexion that speaks of good living and better health. He's built his career on intimidating opponents through a combination of superior chip stacks, psychological warfare, and the implied threat of violence from the ivory-handled Remington that rides low on his right hip. But Tyler has made a crucial miscalculation. He's confused Doc's physical frailty with weakness, interpreting the consumption that's slowly killing the dentist as a sign that he's dealing with a man afraid of violence, afraid of death, afraid of the kinds of confrontation that separate winners from losers in frontier society. The hand that changes everything begins innocuously enough. Doc's showing a pair of kings, while Tyler displays an ace and a jack, a strong hand, but not unbeatable. The betting escalates gradually, each man testing the other's resolve with increasing raises that soon reach the kind of money that represents serious stakes. "You're 100, and I'll raise you 2, Tyler announces, pushing chips toward the center of the table with a flourish that suggests absolute confidence in his hand. Doc studies his hole cards with the same detached interest he once brought to examining patients' teeth. He's holding a third king, giving him 3 of a kind, a powerful hand that beats Tyler's probable 2 pair, but loses to a full house or 4 of a kind. The mathematics of the situation suggest that Doc is favoured to win, but poker is a game where psychology often trumps probability. "I'll see your 200, Doc says, his voice carrying the soft Georgia accent that tuberculosis has reduced to barely more than a whisper, and raise you 500. The bet sends ripples through the long branch. $500 represents more money than most cowboys see in 2 years of trail driving, and the size of Doc's raise suggests either supreme confidence or elaborate bluffing. Tyler studies Doc's face, searching for some tell that might reveal the strength of his hand, but finds only the pale, impassive features that have made Holiday famous from Kansas to Arizona. Tyler's problem is that he's holding exactly what Doc suspects: 2 pair, aces and jacks. A strong hand that beats most holdings, but loses to trips, straights, flushes, and full houses. The smart play would be to fold, accepting a manageable loss rather than risking everything on a hand that's good but not great. But Tyler's pride has been stung by Doc's aggressive betting, and something in the dentist's calm demeanour suggests weakness rather than strength. "You're 500, Tyler says, his voice carrying more confidence than he feels, and I'll raise you 1,000. The bet represents Tyler's entire stake for the evening, everything he's won during 6 hours of steady play, plus a significant portion of his travelling bankroll. It's the kind of bet that either establishes dominance or destroys a man's reputation, and everyone in the Long Branch understands that they're witnessing something more significant than a simple card game. Doc doesn't hesitate. "I'll call your 1,000, Mr. Tyler, and raise you another 2,000. The raise is so large that it takes Tyler several seconds to comprehend its magnitude. $3,000 represents a small fortune in 1878 America, enough to buy a substantial ranch or establish a major business enterprise. The fact that Doc is willing to risk such an amount suggests either absolute certainty in his hand or a level of reckless indifference to money that borders on madness. Tyler stares at Doc's pale face, searching for some sign of uncertainty, some indication that the tubercular dentist is bluffing with nothing more than supreme confidence and theatrical nerve. But Doc's expression reveals nothing beyond mild interest in the outcome, as if he's discussing the weather rather than wagering more money than most men see in a lifetime. That's a substantial raise, Doc," Tyler says, his voice beginning to show the strain of the situation. "Indeed it is, Mr. Tyler. But then, substantial hands require substantial betting." Doc's voice carries a hint of amusement, as if he's enjoying some private joke that only he understands. Tyler counts his remaining chips, calculating whether he has enough money to cool Doc's raise. The mathematics are brutal. He can cover the bet, but doing so will leave him essentially broke, dependent on winning this single hand to avoid financial ruin. But folding means acknowledging defeat, accepting that he's been outplayed by a dying man whose reputation rests more on luck than skill. Pride, greed, and the accumulated pressure of 6 hours play combine to make Tyler's decision for him. "I'll call your raise, Doc. Let's see what you're holding." Doc turns over his hole card, with the same casual gesture he might use to adjust his cufflinks. The third king appears on the green, felt like a judgment from above, confirming what the mathematics had suggested all along, that Tyler's two pair, no matter how strong they might seem, are inadequate against superior holdings. Tyler stares at the revealed cards for a long moment, as if hoping that concentrated attention might change their values. When reality finally penetrates his shock, he turns over his own hole cards with the mechanical movements of a man in a trance, revealing the aces and jacks that have just cost him everything. "3 kings," Doc says unnecessarily, beginning to collect his winnings with the methodical precision he brings to everything. "I believe the hand is mine, Mr. Tyler." But Tyler's humiliation runs deeper than mere financial loss. He's been outplayed by a man he considered inferior, defeated by superior skill masquerading as luck, and the psychological impact proves more devastating than the monetary damage. As Doc stacks chips with mechanical precision, Tyler's face flushes red above his collar, and his right hand moves toward the ivory-handled Remington at his hip. "That was mighty convenient, Doc," Tyler says, his voice carrying implications that every man in the Long Branch recognizes as fighting words. Mighty convenient indeed, the way them cards fell. The accusation hangs in the air like gunsmoke. In frontier society, suggesting that a man cheats at cards is equivalent to calling him a liar, and a thief insults that can only be answered with violence. Doc's pale eyes fix on Tyler's face with the intensity of a surgeon preparing to make a delicate incision, and his right hand moves almost imperceptibly toward the nickel-plated Colt beneath his coat. "Mr. Tyler." Doc's voice remains soft, but it now carries an edge like a straight razor. "You'd best be very careful about what you're implying. A man's reputation for honesty is his most valuable possession, and I've never taken kindly to those who question mine." Tyler's hand hovers near his gun, but something in Doc's pale eyes gives him pause. This isn't the hesitation of fear. It's the calculation of a man who suddenly realized that he might be facing something more dangerous than he initially assumed. Doc Holliday's reputation as a gunfighter is still developing in 1878, but stories about his deadly accuracy are beginning to circulate through the gambling fraternity. I'm not implying anything, Doc. I'm saying it straight out. That was the luckiest hand I've ever seen, and luck that consistent makes a man wonder. The challenge is explicit now, and everyone in the Long Branch knows what happens next. Doc rises from his chair with the fluid grace of a man who's prepared for this moment since the cards were first dealt. His movement is unhurried, almost casual, but there's something predatory in the way he positions himself, angling his body to present a smaller target while keeping his gun hand free. Mr. Tyler, if you have something more substantial than suspicion to support your accusations, I'd be happy to hear it. If not, I'd suggest you accept your losses like a gentleman and retire for the evening. But Tyler has gone too far to back down now. The combination of financial loss, wounded pride, and public humiliation has pushed him past the point where rational calculation might save his life. His hand drops toward his gun with grim determination, knowing that he's probably facing a superior opponent, but unable to accept defeat without a fight. Doc's draw is a masterpiece of controlled violence, faster than thought, but precise as surgery. His nickel-plated Colt appears in his hand with supernatural speed, but instead of aiming for Tyler's heart or head, he targets the gambler's gun hand with mathematical precision. The shot echoes through the Long Branch like thunder, and Tyler's ivory-handled Remington spins away from nerveless fingers, its barrel nicked by Doc's bullet. Tyler stands frozen, staring at his empty hand, while a thin line of blood appears where Doc's bullet creased his knuckles without causing serious damage. "Mr. Tyler," Doc says, his smoking pistol trained on the gambler's chest but making no move to fire again, "I could have killed you as easily as breathing. Instead, I've chosen to provide you with a lesson in the dangers of making accusations you cannot support." Tyler flexes his fingers, testing for broken bones and finding only minor damage. The precision of Doc's shooting is so superior that it seems almost supernatural. The ability to wound rather than kill, to demonstrate mastery without committing murder. "Jesus Christ, Doc," Tyler whispers, his face pale with the realization of how close he's come to death. "I've never seen shooting like that. I trust this experience will discourage you from questioning other men's honesty in the future," Doc replies, holstering his weapon with the same fluid motion he used to draw it. A man should be very certain of his facts before making such serious accusations. Tyler nods, understanding that he's been given a lesson in more than marksmanship. He's learned that some men are so dangerous that even approaching death only makes them more precise, more deadly, more willing to demonstrate that reputation and reality sometimes align with mathematical certainty. As Tyler bandages his wounded hand and prepares to leave Dodge City on the next eastbound train, Doc returns to his corner table and orders another whiskey. He coughs into his silk handkerchief, and you notice fresh bloodstains among the older ones. Tuberculosis continuing its relentless work, even as Doc demonstrates his superiority with firearms. Later, you'll learn that this confrontation establishes Doc Holliday's reputation as a gunfighter whose skill transcends mere speed or aggression. He becomes known as a man who can place bullets exactly where he wants them, who can choose between wounding and killing with surgical precision, and who remains coldly professional even when facing death from multiple sources. But tonight, in the aftermath of the most precise shooting demonstration in Dodge City history, you're witnessing the birth of a legend, not just another fast gun, but a scientific killer whose tuberculosis seems to have concentrated all his remaining life force into his hands and eyes, making him perhaps the most accurate shooter who ever lived. The age of the surgical gunfighter has found its perfect practitioner in the person of Doc Holliday, a dying man who shoots with the precision of a Swiss watchmaker and the cold calculation of a mathematics professor. Let's move to our ninth story. Get comfortable and listen to a tale of vaquero pride against cowboy arrogance. You're in South Texas, near the Mexican border, on a scorching afternoon in August 1873. The landscape stretches endlessly in all directions, rolling hills covered in mesquite, prickly pear, and the hardy grasses that sustain the massive herds of longhorn cattle that form the foundation of the region's economy. This is contested territory in more ways than one, where Mexican vaqueros and American cowboys compete for the same jobs, the same land, and the same respect in a culture that values skill with horses and cattle above almost everything else. The Esperanza Ranch spreads across 50,000 acres of this harsh but beautiful country. Its boundaries marked more by tradition and mutual understanding than by formal surveys or legal documents. Don Carlos Esperanza, the ranch's owner, has managed to maintain his family's holdings through the turbulent decades that saw Texas independence, American annexation, the Mexican War, and the Civil War by adapting to changing political realities while preserving the essential character of his operation. Today, that character is being tested in a confrontation that represents far more than a simple dispute between employees. It's a clash between two fundamentally different approaches to working cattle, two distinct cultures, and two men whose skills have made them legendary in their respective communities. Carlos Mendoza sits his horse with the fluid grace that marks him as one of the finest vaqueros in Texas. At 28, he spent his entire adult life perfecting skills that were old when his grandfather learned them from Spanish colonists who brought cattle to the New World 3 centuries ago. His equipment tells the story of that heritage, a hand-tooled saddle that's been in his family for generations, silver-mounted spurs that chime softly with each movement of his horse, and most importantly, a 60-foot riata woven from rawhide by masters whose techniques have been passed down through countless generations. Mendoza's appearance reflects both his pride in his heritage and his understanding of practical necessity. His clothes are simple but well-made leather chaps that bear the scars of countless encounters with thorns and brush, a white cotton shirt that stays relatively clean despite the dusty conditions, and a broad-brimmed hat that provides essential protection from the brutal Texas sun. But it's his hands that mark him as something special, scarred but sensitive, capable of feeling the slightest vibration through 60 feet of braided rawhide, able to judge distance and angle with mathematical precision. Across the ranch yard stands Bull Morrison, newly arrived from East Texas, with credentials that would be impressive anywhere else, but seem somehow inadequate in this land, where vaquero traditions run deeper than the roots of mesquite trees. Morrison earned his nickname, honestly. He's built like the animals. He works 6'3" and 250 pounds of muscle and bone, hardened by years of wrestling steers and breaking horses. His approach to cattle work emphasizes strength over finesse, determination over subtlety, and the kind of direct confrontation that wins respect in cowboy culture. Morrison wears the uniform of his trade-worn Levi's, a work shirt that's seen better days, and boots that prioritize function over appearance. His hat shows the kind of wear that comes from daily use rather than careful maintenance, and his gun belt carries a well-used Colt .45 that's seen action in various confrontations across East Texas. He represents the American approach to cattle work: practical, efficient, and completely confident in its superiority over older, more traditional methods. The confrontation began 3 days ago, when Morrison publicly questioned the worth of vaquero techniques in general, and Mendoza's skills in particular. He'd been drinking at the cantina in the nearby town of Esperanza, when the conversation turned to the relative merits of different approaches to working cattle. "All this fancy rope work is just for show," Morrison had announced, his voice carrying the authority of a man who's never doubted his own expertise. "When you need to get serious work done, you need American methods, good horses, good guns, and men who aren't afraid to get their hands dirty." The insult was carefully calculated to provoke exactly the kind of response that Morrison wanted. By questioning not just Mendoza's individual abilities, but the entire tradition that he represents, Morrison was challenging the fundamental assumptions that govern life in this border region, where Mexican and American cultures intersect in complex and sometimes volatile ways. Mendoza had been present when Morrison made his statement, and his response was measured but unmistakably challenging. "Señor Morrison, perhaps you would care to demonstrate the superiority of your methods in a practical comparison. I would be honored to show you some of the techniques that you seem to find so inadequate." The challenge was accepted immediately, and within hours the entire region knew that Carlos Mendoza and Bull Morrison would face each other in a contest that would determine, once and for all, whether traditional vaquero skills could compete with modern cowboy methods. Now, 3 days later, the confrontation is about to begin. The rules are simple but demanding. Each man will attempt to rope and immobilize a wild longhorn bull selected from the ranch's most difficult animals. Morrison will use his gun if necessary, while Mendoza will rely solely on his riata. The first man to completely control his animal wins not just the contest, but the right to claim superiority for his entire approach to cattle work. The bulls selected for this contest are magnificent and terrifying specimens, each weighing over 1,000 pounds, with horn spreads that reach 6 feet from tip to tip, and temperaments that make grizzly bears seem friendly by comparison. These animals have lived wild on the range for years, avoiding human contact and developing the kind of cunning and aggressiveness that makes them legendary among cattlemen. Morrison approaches his bull with the direct, confrontational style that has made him successful throughout East Texas. He rides straight at the animal, his rope spinning in wide loops as he prepares for a traditional head catch that will allow him to use his horse's strength to control the bull through brute force. The bull, however, has other plans. As Morrison's loop settles around its massive head, the animal explodes into motion with surprising speed, charging directly at horse and rider with the kind of focused aggression that has gored countless vaqueros over the centuries. Morrison's horse, well trained but not accustomed to this level of violence, shies sideways, disrupting the angle that would have allowed Morrison to use leverage and positioning to his advantage. What follows is a brutal contest of strength against strength, with Morrison's horse struggling to maintain position while the bull fights the rope with every ounce of its considerable power. Morrison shows his skill by keeping his seat and maintaining control of his rope. But it quickly becomes apparent that this approach, while eventually successful, requires enormous expenditure of energy by both horse and rider. After 10 minutes of violent struggle, Morrison finally manages to maneuver his bull into position where he can dismount and tie the animal's legs, completing the requirements of the contest. But both he and his horse are exhausted by the effort, and the bull remains dangerous and unpredictable, despite being temporarily immobilized. Mendoza's approach demonstrates the fundamental difference between vaquero and cowboy philosophies. Instead of confronting his bull directly, he begins a complex dance of approach and retreat that gradually accustoms the animal to his presence. His riata moves through the air in patterns that seem almost mystical, not just spinning loops, but figures of 8 butterfly patterns and complex geometries that hypnotize both bull and spectators. When Mendoza finally makes his throw, It's not the single dramatic cast that Morrison employed, but the first movement in a complex sequence that demonstrates mastery over both animal and equipment. His initial loop settles around the bull's hind feet, a catch that requires perfect timing and positioning, but allows him to control the animal's movement without triggering the kind of explosive resistance that Morrison encountered. With his first throw successful, Mendoza begins a systematic process of additional casts, each one designed to further restrict the bull's movement while avoiding the kind of direct confrontation that leads to violent struggle. A second loop catches the bull's front feet, while a third settles around its neck, creating a web of control that renders the animal helpless without ever triggering its fight or flight instincts. The entire process takes less than 5 minutes, and when it's complete, the bull stands quietly, more puzzled than angry, held in place by Mendoza's Reator work with a precision that seems to defy the laws of physics. Mendoza dismounts casually, approaches the immobilized animal, and ties a final knot that secures his victory. Morrison stares at Mendoza's performance with the expression of a man whose fundamental assumptions about the world have been challenged by incontrovertible evidence. The Vaquero's demonstration wasn't just superior in terms of efficiency and elegance, it was superior in every measurable way, requiring less time, less effort, and producing better results. Jesus Christ, Carlos, Morrison says finally, his voice carrying genuine admiration mixed with profound surprise. I've never seen anything like that. How did you learn to rope like that? Mendoza begins coiling his Reator with the same methodical precision he brings to everything. His movements automatic after years of practice. Seor Morrison, my grandfather taught me, as his grandfather taught him. These techniques are older than Texas, older than America. They work because they understand the animals we work with, not because they overpower them. Morrison approaches the vaquero, extending his hand in a gesture of respect that transcends cultural differences. Carlos, I owe you an apology. I spoke from ignorance, and you've shown me just how ignorant I was. Would you be willing to teach me some of those techniques? Mendoza accepts Morrison's handshake, understanding that he's witnessed something rare in frontier society. A man humble enough to acknowledge superior skill and wise enough to want to learn from it. Seor Morrison, it would be my honor. But I must warn you, these skills take many years to master. There are no shortcuts to excellence. Morrison nods, beginning to understand that he's encountered something more significant than superior rope work. He's discovered an entire philosophy of working with animals rather than against them, an approach that requires patience, understanding, and the kind of cultural wisdom that can't be learned from books or brief demonstrations. As the crowd disperses and the two men begin the process of releasing their respective bulls, you remain in the ranch yard, scribbling notes about what you've witnessed. This wasn't just a contest between two skilled cowboys. It was a demonstration of how traditional knowledge, properly applied, can prove superior to newer methods that emphasize force over finesse. Later, you'll learn that Morrison becomes one of Mendoza's most dedicated students, spending months learning vaquero techniques that transform him from a competent cowboy into something approaching an artist. The friendship that develops between them demonstrates that skill, properly demonstrated, can bridge cultural differences that seem insurmountable. But tonight, in the aftermath of the most educational roping demonstration in Texas history, you're witnessing something more important than a simple victory of tradition over innovation. You're seeing proof that excellence recognizes no cultural boundaries, and that the willingness to learn from others, regardless of their background, is the mark of true wisdom. The age of the vaquero may be ending as American methods dominate the cattle industry, but Carlos Mendoza has proven that the skills and knowledge accumulated over centuries still have value for those wise enough to recognize and learn from them. Let's move to our final story. Settle in for a tale closer to home, your own. You sit in your newspaper office in Tombstone, Arizona Territory on a cool evening in October 1885. The silver boom is beginning to fade, the mines are flooding, and the wild days that made this town famous are drawing to a close. But tonight, you're not thinking about Tombstone's declining fortunes or the uncertain future of frontier journalism. Tonight, you're remembering the confrontation that nearly ended your career and your life 3 months ago. It started, as these things often do, with a story that someone didn't want told. Mayor Harrison Fletcher had been systematically buying up mining claims from desperate prospectors at prices far below their actual value, using his political influence to access geological surveys that weren't available to the general public. It was a classic case of insider trading, frontier style, and it was making Fletcher rich while bankrupting the very men whose votes had put him in office. You'd spent weeks documenting Fletcher's activities, interviewing miners who'd been cheated, examining public records that revealed the scope of his financial manipulations, and building the kind of ironclad case that separates real journalism from gossip and speculation. Your investigation revealed that Fletcher had accumulated over 40 mining claims worth an estimated $500,000, all purchased for a fraction of their value from men who didn't understand what they were selling. The story ran on the front page of the Tombstone Tribune on the 15th of July, 1885, under a headline that left no room for misinterpretation: Mayor's mining schemes leave honest miners destitute. The article detailed Fletcher's activities with the kind of precision that comes from months of careful research, naming names, citing specific transactions, and providing documentation that made denial impossible. Fletcher's response was swift and predictable. Within hours of the Tribune's publication, he appeared at your office with 2 hired guns whose reputations were well known throughout the territory. Jim Snake Eyes Davidson and Carlos Vega were professional killers who'd built their careers by intimidating, beating, and occasionally murdering anyone who threatened their employer's interests. Their presence in your office was intended to deliver a message that didn't require words. "That was quite a story you published today," Fletcher had said, his voice carrying the kind of false calm that suggests barely controlled rage. Very detailed, very creative. You'd been expecting this confrontation since the moment you decided to investigate Fletcher's activities. Frontier editors who expose corruption rarely enjoyed long, peaceful careers, and you'd made your peace with the possibility that journalism might prove a more dangerous profession than you'd initially imagined. "Every fact in that story is documented and verifiable, Mayor Fletcher," you'd replied, your hand moving instinctively toward the desk drawer where you kept a loaded Colt .38. "If you have evidence that anything I printed is incorrect, I'd be happy to publish a correction." Fletcher's laugh carried no humour. "Oh, I'm not here to discuss corrections. I'm here to discuss retractions. Full retractions, along with a front-page apology for your slanderous accusations. And if I refuse?" Fletcher had glanced meaningfully at his 2 companions, both of whom were resting their hands on their gun grips with the casual confidence of men who'd killed before and expected to kill again. "Well, let's just say that frontier journalism can be a hazardous profession. Accidents happen. Printing presses catch fire. Editors sometimes have unfortunate encounters with desperados. The threat was explicit enough to constitute a criminal offence, but Fletcher was counting on the fact that Tombstone's law enforcement was either corrupt, incompetent, or simply overwhelmed by the scale of criminal activity in the territory. He was probably right on all 3 counts. But Fletcher had made a crucial miscalculation. He'd assumed that you were like most frontier editors, a failed lawyer or broken-down politician who'd taken up journalism as a last resort and could be intimidated into silence by the threat of violence. He didn't understand that you'd chosen journalism not as a default career, but as a calling, and that your commitment to truth-telling was stronger than your instinct for self-preservation. "Mayor Fletcher," you'd said, rising from your chair with deliberate slowness, "I appreciate you clarifying your position so explicitly. It makes my response much easier." You'd walked to the front window of your office, where Fletcher's hired guns could be clearly seen by anyone passing on the street. "Gentlemen, you're welcome to try intimidating me into silence, but you should understand that failure to do so will result in an even more detailed exposé of the mayor's activities, including his use of hired killers to silence legitimate journalism." Fletcher's face had flushed red above his carefully waxed mustache. "You're making a serious mistake, newspaper man. I'm offering you one chance to do this the easy way, and I'm declining your generous offer. Good day, gentlemen." The three men had left your office, but their departure felt more like a temporary withdrawal than a permanent retreat. You'd spent the rest of that day preparing for what seemed like an inevitable confrontation loading weapons, reviewing your insurance policies, and writing letters to journalistic colleagues in other territories who might continue your investigation if you didn't survive to complete it. The confrontation came 3 days later, on a Sunday morning, when Tombstone's streets were relatively quiet and most citizens were either in church or sleeping off Saturday night's excesses. You were working in your office, preparing the next week's edition, when Fletcher appeared in your doorway alone this time, but with his hand resting on the grip of an ivory-handled Colt that looked too expensive and too clean to have seen much honest use. "Last chance, newspaper man," Fletcher had said, his voice carrying the kind of forced confidence that suggests a man trying to convince himself of his own courage. "Retract that story, print an apology, and we can all go back to our regular business." You'd looked up from your typesetting, your hands continuing their work, while your mind calculated distances, angles, and probabilities. Fletcher was standing in your doorway, backlit by the morning sun, presenting himself as a perfect target for anyone with adequate marksmanship skills and sufficient motivation. "Mayor Fletcher," you'd replied, "never stopping your work, I've given your proposal all the consideration it deserves. The answer remains no." Fletcher had drawn his gun then, but his movement suggested a man more familiar with intimidation than actual violence. His draw was slow, theatrical, designed to frighten rather than kill. The kind of mistake that separates amateurs from professionals in the deadly serious business of frontier gunplay. You'd been prepared for this moment since Fletcher's first visit. Your right hand had dropped below the level of your desk, where the loaded .38 waited in its specially modified drawer that allowed you to draw and fire without rising from your chair. Your shot had taken Fletcher in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his ivory-handled Colt skittering across your office floor. "Mayor Fletcher," you'd said, rising from your chair with your smoking pistol trained on his chest, "you've just committed attempted murder in front of multiple witnesses." You'd nodded toward the window, where several passers-by had stopped to stare at the scene unfolding in the newspaper office. "I trust this concludes our business relationship." Fletcher had staggered out of your office, clutching his wounded shoulder and muttering threats that everyone understood were empty. Within a week, he'd left Tombstone permanently, his political career destroyed and his mining schemes exposed to the kind of public scrutiny that makes corruption impossible to sustain. But your victory had come at a cost. The confrontation with Fletcher had established your reputation as a man willing to fight for his principles, but it had also marked you as a dangerous enemy to anyone engaged in the kind of activities that attract journalistic attention. You'd received threats from other politicians, mining speculators, and criminal organizations who understood that an honest newspaper could be more dangerous than a company of cavalry. Now, 3 months later, you're preparing to leave Tombstone as the silver boom ends and the town's wild days fade into history. Your investigation of Fletcher's corruption had been your greatest journalistic triumph, but it had also taught you that the price of truth-telling in frontier society can be measured in blood as well as ink. As you pack your printing equipment and prepare for the journey to your next assignment, a newspaper position in California, where civilization has progressed to the point where editors are more likely to be sued than shot you. Reflect on the lessons you've learned during your time in the American West. You've witnessed gunfights that became legends, documented the rise and fall of boom towns, and discovered that courage comes in many forms, not just the willingness to face death in single combat, but the determination to tell uncomfortable truths, regardless of the consequences. You've learned that journalism, properly practiced, is indeed a form of combat, a battle between truth and falsehood, where the weapons are words and the casualties are reputations. Tonight, as you write your final editorial for the Tombstone Tribune, you choose your words carefully. The American frontier has been built by men and women willing to face impossible odds in pursuit of their dreams. Cowboys and miners, gamblers and preachers, gunfighters and newspaper editors, all have contributed to the great work of carving civilization from wilderness. But perhaps the most important lesson of the frontier experience is that true courage isn't measured by speed with a gun or skill with a rope, but by the willingness to stand for principles that matter, regardless of the personal cost. The stories we've told in these pages of legendary gunfights, impossible deeds of marksmanship, and confrontations that separated heroes from cowards represent more than entertainment or sensationalism. They represent the fundamental American belief that individual character matters, that personal honor is worth fighting for, and that, in the great contest between right and wrong, good men and women must be willing to take sides. As Tombstone's silver boom ends and this great adventure draws to a close, we can take pride in having witnessed and documented one of the most remarkable periods in American history. The frontier may be closing, but the spirit that built it, the willingness to fight for what matters, will continue to define us as a people long after the last gunfighter has holstered his weapon and the last newspaper editor has set his final type. Thank you for reading, and may God bless the United States of America. You set down your pen and lean back in your chair, listening to the desert wind that blows through Tombstone's empty streets. Tomorrow, you'll catch the westbound stage to California, carrying with you the memories of the most dangerous and rewarding years of your life. You've been shot at, threatened, and nearly killed in service of your profession. But you've also witnessed history being made by men and women whose courage and determination will inspire generations to come. As you extinguish the lamp and prepare to leave your office for the final time, you smile at the irony that your own confrontation with Mayor Fletcher will probably become just another story told in frontier saloons, embellished and mythologized until the newspaper editor who faced down corruption with nothing but a printing press and a .38 Colt becomes as legendary as any gunfighter who ever walked these streets. The age of the frontier editor may be ending, but the age of American journalism, with its commitment to truth-telling, regardless of the consequences, has just begun. Thank you for listening to these tales of courage, skill, and honor from the American frontier. The men and women whose stories we've shared tonight, from Wild Bill Hickok's first quick-draw duel to Annie Oakley's hidden confrontation, from Doc Holliday's surgical precision to Carlos Mendoza's rope artistry, represent more than historical curiosities or entertainment. They embody the American spirit at its most essential, the belief that individual character matters, that skill and determination can triumph over seemingly impossible odds, and that sometimes the most important battles are fought not between armies, but between individuals willing to stake everything on their principles. The frontier era that produced these legendary confrontations is long past, but the values they represent, courage, honour, the willingness to stand for what's right, regardless of the personal cost, remain as relevant today as they were in the dusty streets of Tombstone or the cattle camps of Wyoming. As you drift off to sleep tonight, remember these stories not as relics of a vanished past, but as reminders of what Americans at their best can achieve when they combine skill with determination, honour with action, and individual courage with collective purpose. Sleep well and dream of a time when right and wrong could be settled with honour, when personal reputation was worth more than life itself, and when the difference between heroes and villains was measured not in words, but in dates. If you enjoyed these stories of the American West's greatest one-on-one confrontations, please like and subscribe for more tales of courage, honour, and the indomitable human spirit that built our great nation. Good night, and may your dreams be filled with the echoes of distant gunfire and the thunder of horses carrying brave riders toward their destinies.